Hello, welcome to another virtual tea class. Today we're going to be giving just a little bit of background information about oolong tea, what it is, how it's made, why it's so famous. Oolong is a style of tea. It's been around since the early 1700s. It was first perfected in Fujian province in China, and it's still primarily grown pretty much just there. There's a few other areas around China where it's grown, and Taiwan is really famous for oolong teas as well, but that's pretty much it. In Chinese, the word oolong translates literally to black dragon, and it's thought that this refers to black snakes that are sometimes found coiled up around tea plants. Now, what makes oolong tea unique is, like pretty much all other kinds of tea, it's defined by its level of oxidation. So where black tea is fully oxidized, very dark, green tea is unoxidized, very light and fresh, oolong tea is partially oxidized. So it's going to be somewhere basically in between green and black tea in terms of the different flavors and heaviness, literally, that you would get out of it. And because of that, you see green oolongs and black oolongs just based on the level of oxidation that you see. And that's why there's so much variety within the oolong family. There can be two completely different oolongs from the same exact region just based on how they're oxidized. So if types of tea were on a spectrum, you would have green tea at the fully unoxidized level. It's the most fresh, it's the most green, literally, it's the most vegetal. And then at the other end of that spectrum, you would have black teas, which are fully oxidized. So those are going to be more sweet, fruity, coppery. And then in the middle is all oolongs. Oolong tea is processed pretty similarly to other kinds of tea. It is first withered or just like sun-dried, and then it's oxidized, and then it's fired to stop the oxidation process. And again, what makes oolong unique is the level of oxidation, the fact that it's somewhat oxidized but not fully oxidized. So after it's withered, oolong tea leaves will be allowed to oxidize for blank amount of time, depending on whether the tea grower wants to make a green oolong or a black oolong. So if the oolong is going to be more green, then it would oxidize for less time, usually no more than like an hour or two. Whereas if you want the oolong to be significantly darker, then the tea grower may leave it to oxidize all day. And at the end of this process, the tea is then fired to stop the oxidation process, kill the enzyme that causes it, in order to preserve the qualities that you've achieved at whatever stage of oxidation it was at. And then, just like all other teas, after it's fired, it is dried and compressed and rolled and finished. Additionally, oolongs are more compressed and more rolled than many other kinds of tea. It's like, as opposed to black or green teas, which might just be left loose, oolong tea is often hand rolled into small pearls or else twisted in order to be compressed for easier storage or in order to make the leaves look more appealing. Oolong tea is historically prized as a kind of tea because it's so hard to make and actually make it turn out well. In particular, certain kinds of oolong, in particular highly oxidized oolongs, are very difficult to make taste the way you want. Because if you're trying to make an oolong this way and you oxidize it too much or too little, then it's going to taste terrible. So the process of making oolong tea was something that evolved very slowly over time. It was not something that was like, okay, let's do this. It was a long, slow experimentation in order to create the different kinds of oolong that we have today that we know are good. But back when oolong was first created, it was kind of like the highest end tea you could get, and it's still some of the more expensive tea you can get. But at the time, oolong became kind of the default tea of the upper class, which tea already was kind of an upper class thing. But so because oolong became so revered and became so well known and very famous, certain types of oolongs began to take on kind of their own characters. You got a couple of really famous types of oolong, like Tieguanyin. Tieguanyin is probably the single most produced tea in China. It's definitely the most produced oolong. Tieguanyin literally translates to iron guanyin. Guanyin is the bodhisattva of mercy and compassion, and he/she is one of the most commonly seen bodhisattvas in East Asia, and especially in China. So supposedly, Tieguanyin as a tea was named Tieguanyin because the first tea plants were found growing around an iron statue of Guanyin. A really famous Taiwanese oolong is Baozhong Oolong. The name literally translates to wrapped in paper. It's one of the earliest Taiwanese oolongs that's still being produced. It's a very green oolong. It was originally named because right when the tea industry in Taiwan started taking off, people would give gifts of oolong to each other wrapped in little paper parcels. And since that was one of the earliest oolongs that Taiwan perfected, that's what they started calling it. Baozhong is one of the oldest Taiwanese oolongs, one of the first that Taiwan really perfected. It's a very green oolong, so it kind of started the trend of Taiwanese oolongs being very light and very fresh and very green. And then that trend became more and more popular and eventually influenced Chinese oolongs, which originally the convention was darker oolongs are better. So like the most famous oolongs, like Da Hong Pao is a really good example. Literally translates to big red robe. It's one of the single most expensive oolongs you can get, and it's very heavily oxidized for an oolong. It's like an 80% oxidation, so it almost tastes like a black tea. And for a really long time in China, that was the convention, is it's the better oolongs are darker, are more bold. And then when the Taiwanese oolong industry really took off, they really specialized on very green oolongs on purpose to try and create like this contrast. And that ended up influencing tastes so much that now when people think of oolong, they're typically thinking of a green oolong, because that's what most people have had, because it's way more common now. The darker oolongs are still kind of the more high-end, more rare, harder to find, much more traditionally Chinese. And so now we're going to do just a quick demonstration on brewing oolong. We're going to do a couple of different oolongs. We're going to do a light oolong and a dark oolong, so you can really see like the differences in the appearance of the two. Unfortunately, we can't have you taste them, but yeah. Just like with brewing any tea, the very first step is going to be to rinse all of the teaware with hot water, which is both to cleanse it and also to heat up, literally heat up the teaware so that the temperature of the tea is not strongly affected when it's poured in. Now first, we're going to brew a fairly green oolong. This is Tieguanyin, so this is the Iron Goddess of Mercy. And when you're brewing oolong, I think the really important thing is that oolong tea leaves have a lot of very subtle flavors in them, and that combined with the fact that the leaves are so tightly rolled means you should always be using a lot of leaves to pretty low water. So that way you can really draw out all the subtle flavors. If you do very high leaves, very short steeps, you'll be able to taste a real progression in the tea. See, this is a pretty light oolong. Our Tieguanyin, I believe, is around 30% oxidized. So the color is very green and very pale. Very first brew is discarded. That second steep is the first steep that you drink. For our second oolong for comparison, I'm going to brew the Phoenix Mountain oolong, which is a much darker oolong. It's going to be roasted, in addition to being oxidized, about 70%. And just like with the first one, we want to do a lot of leaves, and we're going to do very short steep times. So you just keep going over a large number of infusions and really draw out the characteristics of the tea. And what I'm brewing our oolongs in today is, this thing is called a gaiwan. People who did not know, it literally just means bowl with a lid. And it was originally invented for brewing oolong tea during, I want to say, the Ming Dynasty. And as you can see, because this one is a darker oolong, it's a more heavily oxidized oolong, the color is significantly darker, and it'll get even more dark the more brews you do. Again, that first steep was discarded. And then you would drink this one. And that's everything for today's class. Thanks for watching, everyone.